So, Steve, you've been training and or working in business and training people across all sorts of subjects for something like 30 years, nearly 30 years. And appraisals is one of those subjects that's come up again and again all the way through that period, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why? It feels like we never get them right still. Why is that?
Fascinating, you're absolutely right. 30 years on. And I think I did my first appraisal training course, I think in 1990. And of course, back in 1990, we'd only had mainstream appraisal for about 10 years. It hadn't been going that long. I know some people will claim from the 1950s, and I think the very first appraisals were born with the separation of ownership and control during the Industrial Revolution. If we can go that far back, but 1980 really kicks it off in the modern era. And the key thing with appraisal is, of course, it's very, very time consuming. It's very time consuming, and therefore managers often tend to put it off. And I think that the second thing, and HR departments have been trying so hard to rectify this, is the fact that it's seen by so many leaders not as their system, but as HR system. And so many leaders think they are doing HR a favour by actually carrying out the process. And part of the training that we offer is to get leaders to take ownership for this. Who's going to get the most out of this? And there's three groups to take a look at who really benefits. And the first one is the appraisee. What's in it for them? What's in it for the individual person? Then what's in it for the appraising manager? And then thirdly, what's in it for the organisation?
Yeah, and I think it's important to come back to the appraisee and the manager, but just looking at the organisational bit, what is it that you think that organisations want? Because I know we always see references to pay scheme. Often it's part of the pay management structure and that kind of thing, isn't it? But what do you think they really want to get out of it?
Well, I think the pay one can be very, very misleading. I think I've only ever worked on a handful of appraisal systems that were actually genuinely related to pay, and that tends to create its own complications as well. And when there is a belief that it is linked to pay, you often get managers bumping people up the grades, of course, to get the best possible pay rises for their staff.
Or something that I've seen, people very upset because it's come down to them not getting a pay rise or not getting a big enough pay.
And this is why I've always been firmly of the belief that the appraisal interview should have nothing to do with pay.
I think I agree with you on that.
To me, I think the big thing about the appraisal and what organisations are really looking to gain is about reinforcing that feeling of growth, development, and above all, and this is a very popular term at the moment, is that sense of engagement. Is this buying into the organisation? Do I feel that the objectives that I have been agreed to, have they been cascaded down the organisation? Do I feel in some way connected to where this organisation is going, and do I feel that I am being given the growth and development opportunities to get there? And that's what appraisal really is all about.
So what you're describing is almost a situation where there's a sort of moral hazard here, isn't there? Because organisations, on the face of it, want appraisals to be leading to people doing what they want to do, building and tying in with the strategy top to bottom, and delivering whatever it is that they're meant to be delivering. But actually it gets almost misdirected somewhere along the way with the focus on dealing with all the issues that perhaps haven't been dealt with during the year with particular individuals or managing pay. And of course we've probably all been in the appraisal situation where you have a lovely hour-long meeting and then because of the link between perhaps some kind of box marking or performance rating and pay at the bottom of it, all of that previous hour disappears straight out of the appraisee's head and it comes down to that bottom line.
Absolutely, and this is where often the grievances come from. So that the warmth of the conversation is not finally recorded in the overall grade or indeed in the overall report that comes through. I always like to open up a session about talking about the golden rules. And amazingly, 30 years on, and it's easy for leaders not to follow some of these. I think the first one has got to be that the emphasis has to be on praise. It sounds like a cliche, but it's absolutely. And when you think about it, it has to be. Most people do far more good than they ever make mistakes. It's got to be about praise. I think the second one, I think, is about the length of time we allow for it. And I've met people who think it could be wrapped up in 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I go, there used to be an advert for Lurpak, and it's saying, give it an hour, it deserves it. And I think that's what appraisal is, you need an hour. But I always recommend that leaders set aside in their diary 2 hours, because you never know, it may well run over. And
actually preparation time as well, because often it feels like people walk into that meeting on both sides, the manager and the person being appraised, and neither of them put any preparation time.
Absolutely, and this is why I've been a fan of for many years now, what I simply call the pre-appraisal meeting. So 7 days, 10 days before the actual meeting, just a short 5-10 minute meeting or an email, just recapping on what the expectations are. And one of the useful things we do on the course actually is to prepare typically 7 pre-appraisal questions that people can think about. And that way the individual comes along to the appraisal having really thought about it, as opposed to just the journey in the car that morning. I think the third one that's is often misunderstood is the 70-30 rule. And of course it's meant to be 70% for the appraisee and 30% for the appraising manager. And the whole point about this is it's the appraisee's appraisal, and the emphasis has to be there. But Paul, I think most misunderstood phrase is the one whereby you should not give negative feedback for the first time at an appraisal. It's often misunderstood that, and I've had many managers react, "Well, you can't give people bad news." And of course you can, but not for the first time. And this is why so many appraisals have developed a bad reputation, because leaders, by the very nature of being human, we don't like to disappoint, we don't like to create conflict, so we tend not to give bad news as it happens, and there's a temptation to store it, and then it all comes out at the end of the year, and it tarnishes what could have been a wonderful opportunity to resolve issues and move forward.
And I bet you've seen it all probably, haven't you, with managers. Have you seen managers doing I don't like to praise too much in appraisals, because then people will start thinking that they're going to get more praise for next year, and that kind of, or this often feeds into the rewards bit as well.
One of the ones that I've heard a few times is, I never give anyone the top mark because there's nothing to work towards for next year.
Yeah, I've heard that a good few times.
Yeah, or maybe more sad than that is, I never give anyone the top mark because if they were that good, they wouldn't be working for me, which is terribly sad to hear that.
Yeah, and I heard that in a really funny situation actually, with somebody who described having their appraisal. And this was in the ambulance service, and they were saying that they had an appraisal marking for attendance and punctuality, and their boss said just that. He said, "Oh, I never give anyone the top mark," and they had a bit of a debate around it, because he said, "Well, in the last year, I've never been late, and I haven't had any days off sick, so why would you not get? What else would I have to do to get the top mark?" And the boss couldn't answer it, so in the end he conceded very begrudgingly.
Well, that's another really interesting point that we discussed on the training is where the benchmarks are and what do they mean. And another issue is, and this is why appraisal training shouldn't be ad hoc, it should be across an organisation. Because an appraising manager should really think of themselves as part of an appraising team. When you start to grade in a silo, you're going to get different interpretations. So it's much better to have managers together working on a common scoring. How would you rate that? How would you rate that? And above all, whatever the benchmark is, whether that's 3 or C or whatever terminology it is, an understanding of what that actually means in terms of performance. And then when you do tick that top box, you are aware of how good that performance is. It's not that no one is ever worth the top grade, it's just that it's normally a very small percentage, typically 3 to 5% in the 5-box system, and that's why you don't tend to get it very often, whereas the middle, the benchmark grade, is typically 70%.
Yeah, you see these sort of distribution curves with them, don't you? And often these systems can get a bit challenging when organisations start getting managers to force people into that curve as well.
Yes, and forced distribution. I came across one of those 2 years ago, and it probably sounded great as an idea, but in terms of the practical application by leaders on the ground, very, very difficult.
Yeah, because you have this mismatch between the expectation and leaders who are then trying to combine the forced distribution and the and the reality of giving a genuine appraisal to the individual.
Yeah.
You get lots of grievances coming out of that. I suppose, and what about those people we've talked about people who feel that their performance is at the top end of the spectrum or should be at the top end of the spectrum? What about those who aren't doing so well? Have you got any hints and tips for managers who are having to give the bad news in the appraisal?
I do, and I always say if somebody has been performing that badly, of course that you should have had the interaction long before now.
And how many times have we seen them
Absolutely.
where they haven't?
Yeah. The annual appraisal really should be a formalisation of at least the 12 monthly one-to-ones that happened before that. And then the whole thing can be a walk in the park.
Yeah. And of course some of that, I guess, ties into the need for managers to prepare for having difficult conversations. Now, I know we often cover that when we're doing appraisal training, but it's a training package in itself as well, really, isn't it? Having difficult conversations and an essential skill for the appraising manager.
Yeah, but very much so. Something I'm often told by leaders is it's the part of the job I dislike most. I hate giving people bad news. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, as humans, we're programmed not to do this. And equally, because we don't want to do something or don't want to enjoy it, we tend to put it off and put it off and put it off. And that is the risk, that is to put off to the annual appraisal, and then it gives a very, very negative impression. There is one final thing from me on this, Paul, and this is the whole cascade of objectives. And it's not uncommon for a more senior leader to say to their report, I know I haven't completed your appraisal, but you go ahead and do yours. This is quite common. It has to be cascaded. Has to be, and there's two reasons for this. One is you have to have a cascade of the corporate objectives all the way down to the front line, and secondly, if it comes from the top, then you will get a much better chance of the appraisal coming in on time without HR having to chase and interfere. So I'm a big fan of it coming from the very top, the chairman appraising the chief executive, and all the way down from there within the set timescales.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that consistency is very important. And some organisations do appraisals by getting each individual to write a sort of short report or an account of what they've done during the year. And I often hear those people grumbling about that because they say things like, well, my manager should know what I've done. Yeah. Have you got any thoughts on that?
I think I'm all in favour of preparing and answering the pre-appraisal questions, and I'm not such a fan of writing in the full report. I think it leads to confrontation on the day. I think if you write in your report and I write mine, there's confrontation there. Whereas if I come in with some very well thought out ideas and problems and issues, I think there's going to be less chance of that.
It always strikes me in today's busy workplaces that often managers don't know the entirety of what somebody's done. So
absolutely,
there's a sort of time and a place for building in some of that. I mean, interesting that you said about training people across organisations. Do you think that the people being appraised should receive training in the system as well?
Very much so. Of course, they don't need as long. And in my experience, I found 2.5 hours is plenty. But I think it's worth having. It really is worth having. So people they understand fully what the system is about, what the expectations are, what the paperwork looks like, and the type of questions they can expect to discuss as we go through the session. So nowhere near as the length of time for a manager, but 2.5 hours, really very, very worthwhile.
Yeah, I know. And actually coming back to that conversation I was saying about the guy in the ambulance service, about the punctuality and attendance marking, if he hadn't been a calm, assertive person and able to stand his ground in a very logical, rational way and make his point, then he might not have got the outcome. So there's almost something around the sort of positive assertiveness skills, isn't there?
Yes, very, very much so. Yeah, very much so. And of course that then leads on to the type of development that can be discussed as a result of the appraisal. One of the common things, of course, is that sometimes managers can promise very expensive development without even check the state of the budget.
They haven't spoken to the learning and development department.
And people can feel very, very let down. Yeah.
So actually, I was going to come back to that at the end, but let's deal with it now. Learning and development, obviously, it's a very positive outcome from an appraisal process to have an assessment of the previous year, but actually for the bulk of the focus to be on future development. And there's often a bit of a challenge with some employees who aren't in the right place in their life for development, and maybe you need to think about that too. But how do you feel the developmental part of appraisal can best be managed? Because it's often the bit that's also almost an also ran at the end of the process, whereas it feels to me it could be more of the process.
Absolutely, and of course what you should never get is a rather critical report, and then a few token training courses filled in the back. I'm a big believer is the two parts have to balance. So if there's been discussion or regarding problems or a discussion regarding huge potential growth, it has to be balanced in the second half with how we're then going to accommodate that. And a phrase that comes to mind is, this way we can use the past to help shape the future.
I want to turn to something that challenges, I know, lots of managers and organisations alike, which is the question of the appraisal targets. We often talk about these SMART targets, and I often think they're quite challenging because they're not always how people live their lives on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. But we teach people, it's the standard part of the appraisal training, isn't it? But actually the other side of that coin is around behaviours. And I know we see this in some particular professions actually, where you get people who are hugely successful, they bring in loads of money for the business, they win loads of tenders, clients, etc. But they leave casualties lying all around them because of the way they treat their colleagues. And I'm wondering how much you've come across the question of the balance between targets and behaviours, because it always feels again that the behaviours are treated as the also ran, but it feels to me that they're really important.
Couldn't agree more. You go back to about the year 2000, before when competencies or what we now call values or behaviours really became mainstream. It really was an also ran. And whatever grade you were going to award somebody was more or less based on their outputs. I think we've now got this wonderful tool in place, a real tool whereby you can say to somebody, you have performed really well, your objectives are incredibly high, however, there are some behaviours we need to talk about. And it's typically, you have a wealth of experience, but you're not coaching and mentoring your colleagues. You're one of our best performers, but you're not always behaving as a full team member. And I think we can link the values, the behaviours, the competencies of a modern day appraisal very, very much into having those difficult conversations. And it does give that extra I think gravitas that a manager needs is sometimes to have the authority of that important part of the appraisal. Whereas if it was just something extra to add on the back of the discussion, it hasn't got it. But once the appraisee realises it's not just what I do, but how I go about doing it, and they both matter, then we'll all think about them.
Yeah, and I think that balance is something that many businesses need to have a close think about and build into the systems, but also with the training with the managers.
I know, Paul, it's something that you're very hot on when you run these courses, and that is dealing with the difficult people, with the difficult appraisees. What advice do you have regarding that?
Well, and they're obviously the people that every manager fears when there'll be that one appraisal probably in a team or a large team that the manager is dreading doing every year, and again we run plenty of training on managing difficult people or challenging people, but there are some sort of fundamental things that would apply in every case that you've done. Again, good preparation, but understanding the tricks of the trade for dealing with it, and with difficult people it's always about containing the behaviour. So actually if you're prepared and you're ready, there are a few appraisals where it's more important to have those facts, those hard facts to explain about things that are a problem, because our classic difficult character will challenge you on absolutely everything and always try and keep you on the back foot. So being well prepared, having the facts, and then confining the conversation, and fundamentally not taking any excuses actually. So if you have, for example, the difficult person, maybe a good example is the difficult person who's dead miserable all the time and drags the whole team down.
What's this? The mood hoover.
Yeah, the mood hoover, and or dementors, as I like to call them sometimes. They suck the joy out of the workplace, and they've just dragged everyone down around them. And the interesting thing, I pick on that one deliberately because actually sometimes they will be resistant to being having that explained to them in an appraisal. But other times it comes as a shock and a surprise to them. They don't realise they're doing it.
Very often.
So this is one where the right approach with the facts all lined up and the explanation and the dialogue. And of course, when we run training on this, we practice it, don't we, in almost
Absolutely.
live situations.
I mean, one of the things we often talk about, Paul, there's only 4 reasons for poor performance or poor behaviour. And one is that people don't know what they're meant to be doing. The second one is, up until now, no one's told them they haven't been doing it. The third one is, they can't do it. And the fourth, and very seldom is this the case, they won't do it.
Yeah. So putting all that before them really clearly and being clear about what behaviours you want coming out of it actually sets you up for all that stuff that follows on there, where you get the improvement that you want, or you move on to other procedures like capability. And who knows, maybe we'll have a chat about that in a future blog. You're set up with all your ducks in a row and you can actually take action on the ones that you need to. So Steve, really interesting discussion. I think it's worth just having a quick summary over what we've talked about. We've had a quick look at the history.
Yeah.
We've talked about quality appraisals and training people, managers and appraisees. Excuse me. We've taken a look at giving the good news and giving the bad news, and dealing with the challenging people.
And then the golden rules. Just add to the whole quality of it.
Is there one key rule that you'd say was most important?
It's preparation.
Preparation.